History is rarely written by the good guys. It's written by the fast guys. On August 2nd, 1100, a king died in the dirt of the New Forest. William Rufus, the King of England, was dead with an arrow through his lungs. His friends fled. Servants looted his body. But his younger brother Henry did something different. He didn't cry, and he didn't chase the killer. He turned his horse and rode like a demon for Winchester. He knew that in the brutal world of the 11th century, a crown isn't inherited, it's stolen. This is the story of Henry I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, a man who started with nothing and built an empire through cold logic, calculated violence, and a revolutionary grip on the law. He was the Lion of Justice, but to get there, he had to be a wolf first. To understand the world Henry stepped into, you have to forget everything you know about modern stability. This was the era of the Norman Conquest. Only 34 years earlier, Henry's father, William the Conqueror, had smashed the Anglo-Saxon world at the Battle of Hastings. The land was still bleeding. The Normans were an occupying force, living in stone castles while the English majority lived in wooden huts, praying for a leader who wouldn't burn their crops. When the conqueror died, he split his world in two. He gave Normandy to his eldest son Robert, and England to his middle son, William Rufus. Henry got 5,000 pounds of silver and a pat on the head. He was the landless prince, a man with a bank account but no borders, while his brothers, Robert and Rufus, were traditional warriors men who defined themselves by the weight of their broadswords. Henry was different. He was nicknamed Beauclerc, which literally means fine scholar. He was one of the few princes of his time who could actually read and write. He studied the law, studied the Romans. He learned that while a sword can take a village, a ledger can control a kingdom. For 12 years, Henry lived in the shadows of his older, louder brothers. He watched them fight. He watched them fail. He was the silent observer at the royal court, learning every weakness of the barons and every loophole in the feudal system. He was waiting for a moment of chaos. Was the death of William Rufus an accident? Official story says a knight named Walter Tyrrell fired at a stag, missed, and hit the king. But historians have been suspicious for 900 years. Tyrrell was a close associate of the Clare family men, who were very close to Henry. As soon as the king fell, Tyrrell fled to France. Henry didn't investigate, he didn't mourn. He bypassed his brother's body and reached the royal treasury at Winchester before the news of the death even arrived. He stood at the gates and demanded the keys to the kingdom's wealth. When the treasurer refused, Henry drew his sword. He wasn't the scholar anymore. He was a man taking what he believed was his by right of being on the spot. Speed was Henry's only weapon. His eldest brother, Robert Curthose, was the rightful heir by Norman tradition. But Robert was thousands of miles away, returning from the First Crusade. Henry knew that if he could get crowned before Robert hit the shores of England, the barons would have a hard time removing him. He reached London within 48 hours. He gathered the few bishops and nobles who were in the city and forced a coronation. On August 5th, 1100, just 3 days after the accident in the forest, Henry was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. It was a political heist of staggering proportions. He had the gold, he had the crown, but he didn't have the people. Yet Henry knew that a king who steals a throne must immediately prove why he deserves to keep it. His brother Rufus had been a tyrant, taxing the church, seizing lands, and bullying the barons. Henry did something brilliant. He issued the Charter of Liberties. It was a PR masterpiece. In this document, he promised to stop the abuses of the crown. He promised to restore the good laws of the past. This wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a contract between the king and his subjects. For the American and European audience, this is a massive historical milestone. This document is the direct ancestor of the Magna Carta and eventually the U.S. Constitution. Henry was the first to admit that even a king has rules he must follow. But the charter wasn't enough. Henry needed to heal the racial divide of his kingdom. The Normans were the masters, but the Saxons were the soul of England. To bridge the gap, Henry married Edith, renamed Matilda, the daughter of the King of Scotland. More importantly, she was the great-niece of Edward the Confessor, the last great Saxon king. By marrying her, Henry wasn't just making an alliance, he was merging the bloodlines. He was telling the English people, "Your kings are now my kings." It was a move that disgusted some of his Norman snobs, who mockingly called the couple Godric and Godiva. But Henry didn't care about their insults. He cared about stability. The honeymoon didn't last long. In 1101, the rightful heir came home. Robert Curthos landed at Portsmouth with an army of Norman knights. He was a hero of the Crusades, a man who had fought at the walls of Jerusalem. To the disgruntled barons of England, Robert was the perfect candidate to replace the Scholar King. The kingdom teetered on the edge of a bloody civil war. The two armies met at Alton. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat and iron. But instead of charging, Henry did what he did best. He negotiated. He knew Robert was broke. He offered his brother a massive annual pension of 3,000 marks if he would just go back to Normandy. Robert took the bait. He valued cold cash more than the cold winters of England. The Treaty of Alton was signed, and the invasion turned into a family reunion. Robert sailed back to Normandy, thinking he had won a fortune. Henry watched him leave, knowing he had just bought himself the most valuable commodity in politics: time. He used that time to systematically hunt down every baron who had supported Robert. One by one, he stripped them of their castles and their power. He was clearing the board, making sure that the next time Robert came, he would find no friends on English soil. By the end of his first year, Henry I had transformed from a landless prince into a formidable monarch. He had outplayed his brothers, outnegotiated the church, and outthought the nobility. But across the English Channel, Normandy was falling into chaos under Robert's weak rule. The Lion of Justice began to look toward his ancestral home. He realized that to truly be safe, he couldn't just rule England, he had to conquer the continent. The first 10 minutes of his reign were about survival. The next 90 would be about empire. By 1102, Henry I realized that holding England required more than just a crown and a sword. It required a system. Most medieval kings ruled through personal presence. They traveled from town to town, eating the local food and yelling at the local lords. Henry wanted something different. He wanted a machine that worked even when he wasn't there. He began building the most sophisticated administrative state in the Western world. He didn't just build castles, he built bureaucracies. He began recruiting men from the dust, low-born but brilliant clerks and lawyers who owed everything to him. These men weren't like the arrogant barons. They were loyal, they were literate, and they were lethal with the ledger. This is where the modern financial world was born. Henry's officials developed the exchequer. The name comes from the checkered cloth used to calculate taxes. It was essentially a giant abacus. Twice a year, the sheriffs of every county had to come to Winchester and account for every penny they collected. If the math didn't add up, the consequences were dire. They used tally sticks, pieces of hazelwood notched to represent sums of money, then split in half, so both the king and the sheriff had a receipt that couldn't be forged. For a 12th century audience, this was terrifyingly efficient. For a modern audience, this is the origin of the IRS and the Treasury. Henry was the first king to realize that math is a more powerful weapon than steel. Henry also transformed the Curia Regis, or the king's court. He didn't want justice to be a local lottery where the strongest bullied. He began sending out itinerant justices, judges who traveled the country representing the king's peace. This was a massive shift in power. Suddenly, a peasant could appeal a lord's decision by invoking the king's name. This wasn't because Henry was a nice guy, it was because every time a royal judge heard a case, the fine went to Henry's pocket, not the local barons. He was centralizing justice to centralize wealth. He was slowly stripping the nobility of their absolute power, and they hated him for it. But there was one power Henry couldn't just tax into submission: the Catholic Church. Henry clashed with Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, over investiture. Essentially, who gets to pick the bishops? The Pope or the King? To the modern eye, this looks like a boring religious debate. But in 1103, it was a constitutional crisis. If the Pope picked the bishops, the king lost control of massive amounts of land and wealth. Anselm went into exile, and Henry seized the church's lands. For years, they fought a cold war of letters and excommunications. Eventually, Henry reached a compromise. He let the church elect the bishops, but only if they did it in his chapel and swore fealty to him first. He was the master of the win-win that actually only benefited him. While Henry was fixing England, his brother Robert Curthos was breaking Normandy. Robert was a good guy, but a bad king. He was so soft-hearted that he reportedly let thieves steal his clothes while he slept. Without a strong duke, Normandy became a failed state. Robber barons built illegal castles and started kidnapping merchants. This wasn't just a French problem, it was an English one. Many of Henry's barons owned land on both sides of the water. They were being dragged into the chaos. Henry realized that a fire in his neighbor's house would eventually burn his own. He began to frame himself as the protector of Normandy. In 1105, Henry decided he had had enough. He didn't just send an army. He brought his entire court. He landed in Normandy not as a conqueror, but as a CEO, coming to fix a bankrupt branch of the family business. He brought chests of silver from his Winchester treasury. He knew that the Norman lords were tired of fighting for a duke who couldn't pay them. Henry's strategy was silver and steel. He would besiege a castle, and while his catapults battered the walls, his agents would be at the back gate with bags of coins. Most of Normandy didn't fall to the sword. It was bought and paid for. Not everyone went quietly. The city of Beal resisted. Henry, usually a man of restraint, decided to make an example of it. He burned the city to the ground. The message was sent across the duchy. The scholar could still be a conqueror. When the neighboring city of Caen saw the smoke from Bayeux, they didn't even wait for Henry to arrive. They sent him the keys to the city and a list of their demands. Henry was proving a fundamental rule of power. You only have to be brutal once, if you are calculated about it. September 1106. The two brothers finally met for their endgame at a small town called Tinchebray. Robert was desperate. He had called in every favor and every debt, but he was outnumbered. Most Norman battles were won by cavalry, but Henry ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot alongside the infantry. He was creating a solid wall of iron that Robert's cavalry couldn't break. For an hour, the brothers' forces hacked at each other in the mud. It was a fratricidal nightmare, men fighting their own cousins and former neighbors. Then, Henry's hidden reserve of Breton cavalry hit Robert's flank. The line snapped. The romantic age of the Crusader knight was crushed by the clinical age of the soldier king. The victory was total. The first time since their father's death in 1087, England and Normandy were reunited under one ruler. Robert Curthos was captured. Henry faced a dilemma. What do you do with a brother who is too dangerous to let go but too royal to kill? Henry's solution was characteristically cold. He sent Robert to Cardiff Castle. He would live there in comfort with fine food and wine for the next 28 years. He would never see the sun outside of a castle wall again. Henry was now the undisputed master of the Anglo-Norman world. He had reached the summit. But as he would soon learn, the view from the top is often obscured by shadows. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we re-dive in deep into the life of a king who often gets overshadowed by his more famous father, William the Conqueror, and his dramatic granddaughter, Empress Matilda. We're talking about Henry I, a man whose reign was a fascinating mix of shrewd politics, brutal efficiency, and a personal tragedy that changed the course of English history forever. So, let's rewind the clock. Henry was born sometime between 1068 and 1069, the fourth and youngest son of William the Conqueror. Being the youngest son in a medieval royal family was basically like being the last one picked for dodgeball. His older brothers got all the good stuff. Robert Curthos got the prestigious Duchy of Normandy. William Rufus got the grand prize, the Kingdom of England. And Richard II sadly died in a hunting accident before he could inherit anything. What did Henry get? A pile of silver, 5,000 pounds of it to be exact. It's a huge sum for sure. But it wasn't land, it wasn't a title, it was just cash. This earned him the nickname Beauclerk, meaning good scholar, because he was well educated, literate, and apparently good with his finances. He was the smart one, the one who had to think his way to the top rather than just inherit it. I think he did. The early years of his life were a masterclass in political maneuvering. His two older brothers, Robert and William, absolutely detested each other. They were constantly fighting, and Henry was caught in the middle, playing them off against one another. He'd side with one, then the other, always looking for an advantage, always trying to carve out a piece of territory for himself. He was imprisoned, exiled, and bounced around Normandy, learning valuable and often harsh lessons about power. He learned that trust was a rare commodity and that opportunity could strike at any moment. And that moment came on August 2nd, 1100. King William Rufus, Henry's brother, was out hunting in the New Forest. You know, just a casual day of chasing deer. Then suddenly an arrow flew through the air and struck the king, killing him instantly. The man who supposedly fired the arrow, a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, immediately fled the scene. Was it a tragic accident? Or was it a conveniently timed assassination? We'll probably never know for sure. But what we do know is what Henry did next. He didn't waste a second mourning. While his brother's body was still lying in the forest, Henry made a mad dash for the royal treasury at Winchester. He seized control of the kingdom's finances, the literal keys to the kingdom. Just 3 days later, he was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. Talk about a quick turnaround. It was a bold, ruthless move that showed everyone exactly what kind of king Henry would be. Decisive, ambitious, and not afraid to get his hands dirty. His older brother, Robert Curthos, was furious. He was off on the First Crusade when all this went down. He came sailing back to Normandy, expecting to claim the English throne, only to find his little brother already sitting on it, wearing the crown. This, of course, meant war. But Henry was prepared. He was a skilled politician. One of his first acts as king was to issue the Charter of Liberties. This was a brilliant PR move. He basically promised the barons and the church that he would not be a tyrant like his brother William Rufus had been. He promised to respect their rights, cut down on unfair taxes, and generally be a much better ruler. This helped him win crucial support among the English nobility. He also made a very strategic marriage. He married Matilda of Scotland. This wasn't just any noble lady. She was a descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon kings of England, the line that had been overthrown by Henry's own father. By marrying her, Henry was symbolically uniting the new Norman dynasty with the old English one. It was a way of saying, hey, we're all in this together now. It was incredibly popular with the common people and helped legitimize his rule. Plus, they went on to have 2 children, a daughter also named Matilda and a son, William Adelin. The future of the dynasty seemed secure. With his support in England solidified, Henry turned his attention back to his brother, Robert. In 1101, Robert invaded England to press his claim, but Henry's political groundwork paid off. Robert didn't get the support he expected from the English barons, and the invasion fizzled out. The 2 brothers signed a treaty, but the peace was short-lived. Henry was a man who finished what he started. He didn't just want England, he wanted his father's entire empire. So, a few years later, in 1106, Henry took the fight to Robert. He crossed the English Channel and invaded Normandy. The decisive battle took place at Tingebray. Henry's army won a crushing victory. He captured Robert and, in a move that was both merciful and incredibly cold, he imprisoned his own brother for the rest of his life. Robert spent the next 28 years locked away in various castles, dying in captivity. With that, Henry had done it. He had reunited England and Normandy, just as his father had ruled them. For the next 2 decades, Henry I's reign was a period of relative peace and prosperity, at least by medieval standards. He was known as the Lion of Justice. He was a strict but effective ruler, centralized the government, creating institutions like the Exchequer to manage the royal finances more efficiently. He sent traveling judges across the country to enforce the king's law, creating a more uniform legal system. This wasn't about being nice, it was about control. Stable, well-run kingdom was a wealthy kingdom, and a wealthy king was a powerful king. He clamped down hard on corruption and crime among his own officials, and he was known for being utterly ruthless with anyone who crossed him. But while his kingdom was stable, his personal life was about to be shattered by an unimaginable tragedy. The year is 1120. Henry's only legitimate son and heir, the 17-year-old William Adelin, is in Normandy with his father. It's time to head back to England. William and his entourage of young boisterous nobles decide to travel on a separate ship. The finest and fastest in the fleet, the White Ship. The story goes that the young prince and his friends spent the evening drinking heavily before setting sail. They were in high spirits, laughing and celebrating. They even reportedly told the priests who came to bless the ship to go away. As they sailed out of the harbor at night, the intoxicated helmsman, who had also been partying, steered the ship straight into a submerged rock. The ship began to sink rapidly. In the chaos, William Adelin was bundled into a small lifeboat and could have escaped. But he heard the cries of his half-sister Matilda and ordered the boat to turn back to save her. As they rowed back towards the wreck, the lifeboat was swamped by other desperate survivors trying to climb aboard. The small boat overturned, and everyone, including Prince William, was thrown into the icy waters of the English Channel. They all drowned. Out of the 300 or so people on board the White Ship, only one person survived, a butcher from Rouen, who clung to a piece of the wreckage until he was rescued the next morning. When the news finally reached King Henry, they say he fainted from grief. And it's said that from that day until the day he died, he never smiled again. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a dynastic catastrophe. Henry's carefully laid plans were in ruins. His only legitimate son was gone. The succession was thrown into complete uncertainty. Henry tried everything. He married a second time to Adeliza of Louvain, hoping for another son, but the marriage remained childless. His only remaining legitimate child was his daughter, Matilda, In an unprecedented move for the time, Henry decided to make her his heir. He gathered all the major barons of England and Normandy and made them swear a solemn oath to accept Matilda as their future queen. He did this not once, but several times, trying to hammer the point home. But a woman ruling in her own right was almost unthinkable. The barons swore the oaths to the king's face, but many of them had their fingers crossed behind their backs. To make matters worse, Matilda was not the most diplomatic person. She was proud, arrogant, and had spent most of her life in Germany as the wife of the Holy Roman Emperor, which is why we call her Empress Matilda. She didn't have many friends among the English nobility. When Henry I finally died in 1135, supposedly from eating a surfeit of lampreys, a type of eel-like fish, he loved his plans fell apart almost immediately. Despite their oaths, the majority of the barons refused to accept Matilda. Instead, they flocked to support Henry's favorite nephew, Stephen of Blue. What followed was a brutal and destructive civil war known as the Anarchy. For nearly 2 decades, England was torn apart as Stephen and Matilda fought for the crown. The country descended into chaos, castles were destroyed, and the people suffered immensely. It was the complete opposite of the peace and order that Henry had worked so hard to build. In the end, Henry's legacy is a complicated one. He was a brilliant, effective, and utterly ruthless king. He brought stability and justice to England, reformed its government, and held his father's empire together through sheer force of will. But it all came crashing down with the sinking of one ship. The loss of his son led directly to one of the darkest periods in English medieval history. His story is a powerful reminder of how fragile power can be, and how even the best-laid plans of kings can be undone in a single, tragic moment. He was the Lion of Justice, a master politician, and a grieving father whose personal loss plunged his kingdom into chaos. And that is the dramatic and often overlooked story of King Henry I. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the past. Let me know in the comments which historical figure you'd like to see covered next. See you in the next one. Picture this: November 25th, 1120. A single ship set sail from Normandy, carrying the future of the English crown. But this ship, the White Ship, would never reach its destination. Its sinking triggered a catastrophe that plunged England into decades of civil war, a period so dark it became known as the Anarchy. This isn't just a story about a shipwreck. It's the story of how one night of tragedy rewrote the destiny of a nation. So, who was on this fateful voyage? The most important passenger was William Adelin, the only legitimate son and heir of King Henry I of England. At just 17, he was the golden boy, the hope for a stable and prosperous future. Alongside him were about 300 of England's brightest and best nobles, knights, and even the king's own illegitimate children. They were the next generation of leaders, celebrating their return to England after a successful campaign in France. The scene at the port of Barfleur was one of celebration, and wine flowed freely, and the mood was electric. The crew and passengers, including the young prince, were reportedly drinking heavily. They were so confident that they even turned away a group of priests who came to bless the ship, laughing them off. This fateful decision was just the first in a series of terrible mistakes. The King Henry I had already set sail on a different ship and arrived safely in England. He left his son to follow on the White Ship, a brand new vessel said to be the fastest and most modern of its time. Eager to catch up with his father and show off the ship's speed, Prince William and his companions urged the captain to race across the channel. Fueled by wine and youthful arrogance, they set off at full speed into the darkness. but their haste proved fatal. Not long after leaving the harbor, the ship struck a submerged rock with incredible force. The sound was horrifying, a crunch of wood and the screams of terrified passengers. The ship began to take on water at an alarming rate. In the chaos, William Adelin was quickly bundled into a small lifeboat, his personal guard ensuring the heir's safety. He was rowing away from the sinking vessel, away from the desperate cries of those left behind. He was almost safe. But then he heard a scream that stopped him in his tracks. It was his half-sister, Matilda Fitzroy, Countess of Perche, crying out for help from the deck of the sinking ship. Torn by a moment of familial loyalty, William ordered his lifeboat to turn back. It was a noble but disastrous decision. As they approached the wreck, scores of panicked people tried to climb into the small boat, desperate to escape the freezing water. Overwhelmed by the weight, the lifeboat capsized and sank, taking the prince and everyone in it down into the dark, icy depths of the English Channel. Out of the 300 people on board, only one person survived. A butcher from Rouen named Barold clung to a piece of the mast all night, eventually being rescued by fishermen the next morning. He was the one who told the world the horrifying story of what happened. He recounted the revelry, the crash, the prince's attempt at a rescue, and the final chilling silence as the ship and its passengers were swallowed by the sea. Back in England, no one dared to tell King Henry the news. His court was paralyzed by fear. For days they whispered amongst themselves, dreading the moment the king would ask why his son hadn't arrived. Finally, they sent a young boy in to break the news. When the king heard that his son, his heir, his entire future was gone, he collapsed in grief. It's said that after that day, King Henry I never smiled again. The personal tragedy was immense, but the political consequences were even greater. With William Adelin dead, the succession was thrown into chaos. Henry's only other legitimate child was his daughter, Matilda. He spent the rest of his reign trying to secure her position as his heir, forcing his barons to swear oaths of loyalty to her. But in the 12th century, the idea of a queen ruling in her own right was almost unthinkable. Many nobles simply didn't accept it. When Henry I died in 1135, the promises made to him were quickly broken. His nephew, Stephen of Blois, saw his chance. He raced to England, seized the treasury, and had himself crowned king. The barons, preferring a male ruler, largely supported him. This betrayal enraged Matilda, who refused to give up her claim to the throne. She gathered her own supporters, and the country split into two factions. What followed was a brutal 19-year civil war known as the Anarchy. England was torn apart. Barons built castles without royal permission, terrorized the countryside, and fought endless petty wars. Law and order completely broke down. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of the time, described it grimly. They said openly that Christ and his saints were asleep. It was a time of famine, destruction, and untold suffering for the common people, all stemming from that one night at sea. The war dragged on for years, with neither Stephen nor Matilda able to land a decisive blow. Castles were besieged, towns were burned, and the country bled. It seemed there was no end in sight. The resolution only came with the next generation. Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, grew into a formidable young leader. He came to England to press his family's claim, and by 1153, the war-weary barons had had enough. They brokered a peace treaty, the Treaty of Wallingford. Under its terms, Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but he had to name Matilda's son, Henry, as his heir. Stephen died just a year later, and in 1154, Henry Plantagenet was crowned King Henry II, the first of the great Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for over 300 years. He restored order, re-established royal authority, and laid the foundations for English common law. When you think about it, the sinking of the White Ship is one of history's ultimate what-if moments. What if the crew hadn't been drinking? What if they hadn't tried to race across the channel in the dark? What if Prince William hadn't turned back for his sister? If that ship had reached England safely, there would have been no anarchy. The Plantagenet dynasty might never have come to power. The entire course of English, and perhaps even world, history could have been completely different. It's a powerful reminder of how a single event, a single moment of tragedy and human error can create ripples that change the world forever. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. See you next time. The 1130s were not the peaceful retirement Henry I had envisioned. Instead of a smooth transition, he found himself caught in a toxic family dynamic. Matilda and Geoffrey were now the power couple of Anjou, and they were impatient. They didn't want to wait for Henry to die. They wanted their inheritance now. They demanded that Henry hand over key royal castles in Normandy to them as a guarantee of their future. Henry, the man who had spent 30 years centralizing power, wasn't about to give it a wave-in to his own daughter. The Lion and the Empress locked horns in a bitter cold war of letters and threats that spanned the English Channel. Henry was now in his mid-60s, a remarkable age for a medieval king. He had outlived almost everyone he had started his journey with. His brothers were dead or in cages. His beloved first wife was gone. His son was at the bottom of the sea. Despite having dozens of illegitimate children and a young wife, Henry was a man fundamentally alone. He spent his final years obsessively traveling between England and Normandy, trying to patch the leaks in his empire. He was a micromanager to the end, personally reviewing treasury accounts and legal disputes, fearful that the moment he stopped moving, the whole structure would collapse. To the common people, Henry's reign was a paradox. It was a time of the Great Peace, where a man could travel with a chest of gold and not be robbed. But that peace was bought with a terrifying level of brutality. Henry didn't just punish criminals, he erased them. He was famous for his blinding and maiming edicts. If you broke the king's peace, you didn't just go to jail, you lost your eyes, your hands, or your manhood. For an American and European audience, this is the dark side of the Lion of Justice. He brought order, yes. But it was an order rooted in a very modern kind of state-sponsored November 1135. Against the advice of his doctors and his court, the 67-year-old king went hunting in the forest of Lyons-la-Forêt. Hunting was the one thing that still made him feel like the young prince who had seized the treasury in Winchester. It was his escape from the nagging demands of Matilda and the looming threat of civil war. But age catches up to everyone, even lions. After a long day in the saddle, the king returned to his hunting lodge, exhausted and hungry. Here we come to the most famous and strangest death in English royal history. Henry's doctors had forbidden him from eating lampreys. Lampreys are jawless, ill-like fish, considered a high-status delicacy in the Middle Ages, but they were notoriously difficult to digest. Henry, stubborn to the last, ignored his physicians. He gorged himself on what the chroniclers called a surfeit of lampreys. That night he fell violently ill. What began as a stomachache quickly turned into an acute fever. The lion was finally brought low, not by a sword or an assassin's arrow, but by a plate of fish. As Henry lay dying over the next week, the atmosphere in the lodge was thick with tension. He knew the end was coming. He confirmed his will, leaving his lands to Matilda, and urging his nobles once again to keep their oaths. He gave a massive sum of money to be distributed to the poor, perhaps hoping to buy a bit of leniency in the next world for the blood he had spilled in this one. On December 1st, 1135, the man who had ruled for 35 years took his final breath. The Lion of Justice was dead. The moment the king's heart stopped, the peace he had spent decades building evaporated. In the Middle Ages, the king's peace died with the king. Without a sitting monarch, there was no law. Neighbors began settling old scores with fire and steel. Merchants stayed inside. The barons, who had spent years being squeezed by Henry's taxes and judges, saw their chance to reclaim their freedom. The vacuum left by Henry's death was a black hole that threatened to swallow the entire Anglo-Norman world. Henry had forced everyone to swear to Matilda, but there was one man who had other plans: Stephen of Blois. Stephen was Henry's favorite nephew, a man the king had enriched and trusted. But Stephen knew the barons hated the idea of a female ruler. While Matilda was stuck in Anjou, mourning her father and dealing with local rebellions, Stephen did exactly what Henry had done 35 years earlier. He rode for the coast. He crossed the Channel, bypassed the towns that stayed loyal to Matilda, and headed straight for London. History was repeating itself, but with a cruel twist. Stephen convinced the Archbishop of Canterbury that the oaths to Matilda were invalid because they had been made under duress. He claimed that on his deathbed, Henry had changed his mind and named Stephen as his heir. It was almost certainly a lie, but it was a lie the barons wanted to hear. Within weeks of Henry's death, Stephen was crowned king. The lion's daughter had been disinherited by her own cousin, using the very tactics her father had pioneered. Henry I was buried at Reading Abbey, an institution he had founded. He left behind a kingdom that was richer, more organized, and more legalistic than it had ever been. But he also left behind the seeds of a 19-year civil war known as the Anarchy. He was a man who could control everything except the future. As we move into the next hour of our documentary, we will see how the lioness peace turned into a wolf's war, and how his daughter Matilda fought a decades-long battle to prove that her father's vision was worth the blood of England. King Henry I was dead, but he was not yet at rest. His body had to be transported from Normandy to his foundation at Reading Abbey in England. And it was a gruesome journey. Medieval embalming was an imperfect science, and chroniclers noted with dark irony that the great Lion of Justice began to rot before he even reached the sea. This physical decay was a chilling metaphor for his kingdom. For 35 years, Henry's iron will had been the only thing holding the Norman and Saxon elements of his realm together. Now, with the king in a box, the scent of weakness was in the air. The peace wasn't just over. It was being dismantled before the body was even cold. While Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, was sprinting for the English throne, where was the rightful heir? The Empress Matilda, Henry's only surviving legitimate child, was trapped in the south of Normandy. She was dealing with a local rebellion and the complications of her own pregnancy. She was also hampered by her gender. In the year 1135, the idea of a woman traveling with an army was nearly unthinkable. She expected the barons who had sworn fealty to her to hold to their sacred oaths out of honor. It was a rare moment of naivety from a woman who was otherwise as cynical and calculating as her father. She didn't realize that in the medieval world, an oath made to a dead man is often worth less than the parchment it's written on. On December 22nd, 1135, Stephen of Blois was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. To the powerful merchants and people of London, Stephen was a relief. He was charismatic, he was male, and most importantly, he was there. He immediately made a series of lavish promises to the church and the nobility, essentially vowing to be Henry I without the cruelty. He abolished the hated forest taxes and promised to respect the traditional rights of the barons. It was a classic honeymoon period for a new regime. But Stephen lacked his uncle's gift for what could be called calculated cruelty. Stephen wanted to be loved, whereas Henry had been content to be feared. And in the 12th century, a king who wants to be loved is a king who will be exploited. Stephen's reign began with a spree of bribery. To keep the powerful barons from joining Matilda, he gave them everything they asked for. Critically, he allowed them to build adulterine castles, private fortifications that Henry I had spent decades tearing down. By giving away this royal prerogative, Stephen was inadvertently feeding the very monsters his predecessor had tamed. The barons eagerly took the gold and the land, but they didn't give loyalty in return. They gave silence a silence that would last only as long as Stephen's treasury remained full. Stephen was buying time, but he was selling the very foundations of royal power. Matilda, however, was not going to disappear. While Stephen was busy being crowned in London, she seized the royal strongholds in southern Normandy. She established her own court and began issuing her own charters, acting as the rightful ruler. She was effectively carving out a kingdom of the south. For us today, this marks the start of a fascinating geopolitical split. The great Anglo-Norman Empire was now a house divided. One claimant, Stephen, held the treasury in England. The other, Matilda, held the ancestral heartland in France. The stage was set for a family feud that would drench the countryside in blood for nearly 2 decades. This wasn't just a squabble over a crown, it was the sundering of an empire. Perhaps the most significant early blow to Matilda wasn't a military defeat. It was the defection of the bureaucracy. Roger of Salisbury, the brilliant administrator who had helped Henry I invent the exchequer, the most advanced financial system in Europe, threw his support behind Stephen. He didn't come alone. He brought with him the entire machinery of the English government. Without these men of the dust, the clerks and accountants who made the kingdom run, and without access to the royal treasury, Matilda was an empress without an engine. She had the right, but Stephen had the keys. This is a recurring theme in the history of power. Legitimacy is often less important than the ability to pay the soldiers. The first external threat to Stephen's rule came, predictably, from the north. King David I of Scotland was Matilda's maternal uncle. Using the pretext of defending his niece's rightful claim, he invaded northern England in early 1136. But this wasn't just a family favor, it was a brazen land grab. The Scottish invasion was brutal, marked by the burning of villages and the slaughter of civilians, shocking even by medieval standards. Stephen was forced to break off his coronation tours and rush north to deal with the threat. He managed to buy them off with land and titles, but the precedent was set. The King of England was now reactive, not proactive. The borders were leaking, and everyone could see it. But the most dangerous man in the room wasn't in Scotland. He was in England, watching and waiting. His name was Robert, Earl of Gloucester. He was Henry I's favorite illegitimate Suna man, many called the best king England never had because of his birth status. Robert was immensely wealthy, a brilliant general, and a cultured patron of the arts. Initially, he swore a conditional oath to Stephen, promising loyalty only as long as the king upheld his own promises. But everyone knew his true loyalty lay with his half-sister, Matilda. He was the kingmaker. As long as Robert stayed neutral, Stephen had a chance. If Robert flipped, the civil war would begin in earnest. By 1137, the Lion's Peace of Henry I was a distant memory. The itinerant judges that Henry had sent across the country to dispense royal justice stopped traveling because the roads were too dangerous. Exchequer's audits became a joke as local sheriffs simply stopped sending money to London. In the absence of a strong central authority, the rule of law was swiftly replaced by the rule of the sword. This is the beginning of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later famously call the time when Christ and his saints slept. It wasn't just a war between two royals. It was the death of the civil society Henry I had spent 35 long years building. Anarchy was bubbling just beneath the surface. Then, in 1138, the fuse was finally lit. Robert of Gloucester, the kingmaker, officially renounced his fealty to Stephen and declared his open support for the Empress Matilda. He sent a formal defiance to the king, a medieval declaration of total war. From her base in Normandy, Matilda prepared to cross the Channel and claim her inheritance by force of arms. The anarchy had officially begun. For the next hour of our story, we will witness a world of scorched earth, broken walls, and the desperate struggle of a woman trying to reclaim a throne in a man's world. The lion was gone, and the wolves were finally at each other's throats. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe for the next chapter in this incredible story. The Cold War was over. In 1139, the conflict between Empress Matilda and King Stephen finally turned hot. Matilda, alongside her brilliant half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, landed on the shores of England. But they didn't make a dash for London. Instead, they sailed for Bristol. This was Robert's home turf, a fortress of loyalty where their father, Henry I, was still revered. For a modern audience, this was the DA of the 12th century. Matilda wasn't just paying a visit, she was establishing a rival capital. Bristol became the heart of her cause, the Angevin cause. From this western stronghold, they launched a systematic campaign, peeling away county after county from Stephen's grasp. The kingdom was now officially decapitated. There was a king in the east and a lady in the west. As the central government crumbled, a terrifying new phenomenon scarred the landscape: the adulterine castles. These were illegal, unlicensed fortifications thrown up by local lords. Under Henry I, building a castle without a royal permit was a death sentence. But under Stephen, it became a necessity for survival. Every minor baron transformed into a local warlord. They didn't build these stone towers to protect the people. They built them to dominate the people. From these jagged stone teeth, they launched raids on their neighbors, kidnapped merchants for ransom, and tortured peasants for their last few bags of grain. The great peace of the Lion of Justice was gone, replaced by 1,000 small, brutal tyrannies. The anarchy had begun. In June of that same year, Stephen made the single greatest tactical mistake of his entire life. Gripped by paranoia, he became convinced the government was plotting against him. So he arrested the 3 most powerful bishops in England, including the legendary Roger of Salisbury, the man who literally held the keys to the entire treasury. He didn't just arrest them, he humiliated them, stripped them of their vast wealth, and seized their castles. In one catastrophic move, Stephen alienated the only institution that could give his reign legitimacy: the Church. Even his own brother, Henry of Blois, who was the Pope's personal representative in England, turned against him. Stephen had broken the cardinal rule of medieval kingship: you never ever wage war on the men who hold the keys to heaven and the keys to the bank. While the south of England burned, the north was turning into a slaughterhouse. King David of Scotland, Matilda's uncle, saw his opportunity and struck again, pushing deeper and deeper into Yorkshire. At a desperate encounter known as the Battle of the Standard, the English lords of the north acting mostly on their own, without any help from Stephen, managed to repel the Scottish invasion. They used their sacred religious banners as a rallying point, a makeshift symbol of unity. It was a victory for England, but it proved a devastating point. The king was no longer the protector of the realm. The people were being forced to protect themselves. Stephen was rapidly losing the mandate of heaven. Shortly after she landed, Matilda found herself trapped in Arundel Castle. Stefan had her completely cornered. This was it. He could have ended the entire war right there and then. He could have captured her, imprisoned her, or sent her packing back to France. But then, in a bizarre move that still baffles historians to this day, Stephen granted her safe conduct. He personally allowed his sworn enemy to leave the castle and join her brother in Bristol, even providing a royal escort to ensure she got there safely. He genuinely believed he was acting with knightly chivalry. In reality, he was committing political suicide. He had the Empress, the very cause of the war, in the palm of his hand, and he just let the lioness go. With the treasury now running on fumes, Stephen began to rely on foreign mercenaries. Mostly Flemish soldiers led by the ruthless William of Ypres. These men weren't fighting for oaths, loyalty, or land. They were fighting for loot. They quickly became the scourge of Middle England. The war shifted from noble charges and pitched battles to something far uglier. Chevauchés, these were scorched earth raids designed specifically to starve the enemy's peasants into submission. If you were an English farmer in the 1140s, it didn't matter whose side you were on. Both armies were burning your house, stealing your cows, and destroying your crops. The social contract between ruler and ruled was dead. Then came February 1141. The war reached its absolute boiling point at the city of Lincoln. A powerful and notoriously fickle nobleman, Rainulf, Earl of Chester, man who switched sides more often than he changed his clothes, had seized Lincoln Castle. Stephen, showing a rare burst of decisive energy, raced north to take it back. But Robert of Gloucester was on the move too. He led a massive force of what were called the disinherited knights, who had lost their lands and titles under Stephen. They marched through the flooded, marshy fens of the east. These men were desperate. They were angry, and they had absolutely nothing left to lose. The Battle of Lincoln was an unmitigated disaster for the king. Seeing the sheer size and ferocity of Robert's army, most of Stephen's cavalry turned and fled almost as soon as the battle began. And Stephen refused to run. He may have been a bad king, but he was an incredibly brave man. He dismounted his horse and fought on foot, swinging a massive two-handed battle axe until the shaft shattered in his hands. He then drew his sword and kept fighting until that, too, snapped at the hilt. Finally, a knight struck him in the head with a rock, and the King of England was wrestled to the ground and captured. For the first time since the Norman Conquest 100 years earlier, a reigning English monarch had been taken prisoner in battle. Stephen was dragged in chains to Bristol and thrown into a dungeon. This was Matilda's moment of total absolute triumph. The usurper was in her cage. The road to London and the throne was wide open. She immediately began styling herself the Lady of the English, preparing for her long-delayed coronation. It seemed at last that the daughter of the Lion had won. But there was a problem. Matilda had inherited all of her father's arrogance, but none of his skill for hiding it behind a charming smile. As she made her triumphant march toward London, her imperial attitude would prove to be far more dangerous to her cause than Stephen's entire army. Matilda arrived at Westminster not as a liberator, but as a conqueror. She immediately demanded a tallage, a massive punitive tax from the citizens of London. When the city leaders came to her and begged for mercy, pleading poverty after years of devastating war, she reportedly screamed at them. She told them they were lucky she wasn't just burning the entire city to the ground. She had completely forgotten the most important lesson her father, Henry I, had learned. You can take a city with a sword, but you can only hold it with a contract. In the next 10 minutes, we will see how the people of London, pushed to the absolute edge, would do the unthinkable. They would rise up against the Empress and drive her from their city, plunging the kingdom back into chaos. Thanks for watching. If you're enjoying this dive into the anarchy, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next one. June 1141. Matilda had everything in her grasp. Her rival, Stephen, was rotting in a Bristol dungeon. The clergy had acknowledged her as Lady of the English. All that remained was the formal coronation at Westminster Abbey. But Matilda was a creature of the Holy Roman Empire, used to the absolute deference of Germany. She didn't understand the social contract that her father, Henry I, had carefully nurtured with the City of London. When the Londoners asked for the restoration of the laws of Edward the Confessor the same, good laws Henry had promised in his charter, Matilda didn't negotiate. She scoffed. She demanded a massive tax to fund her coronation, treating the citizens like a conquered tribe rather than her subjects. The Londoners had reached their breaking point. Just as Matilda was preparing for her coronation banquet, the church bells of the city began to ring in a rhythmic, frantic pattern. This wasn't a call to prayer, it was a call to arms. A massive, disorganized mob of thousands of citizens surged toward Westminster. For the first time in history, the Commune of London acted as a political force. Matilda, surprised and unprepared, was forced to flee the dinner table. She didn't even have time to pack her royal robes. She and her knights galloped out of the city just as the mob smashed through the doors of the palace. The coronation was canceled by the people. While the Empress Matilda fled, another Matilda rose to prominence. Matilda of Boulogne, the wife of the imprisoned King Stephen. She was the mirror image of the Empress, brave, tactically smart, but crucially, she was beloved. While her husband was in chains, she had been raising an army in Kent and securing the support of the Londoners. She was the one who orchestrated the uprising. In the chess match of the 12th century, the two Matildas were now the only players that mattered. One was fighting for her inheritance. The other was fighting for her husband's life. The Empress retreated to Oxford, then pushed south to Winchester, the old capital and the site of the royal treasury. She hoped to corner Stephen's brother, Bishop Henry of Blois, who had flipped his loyalty back to the king. Winchester became a literal war zone. The Empress's forces occupied the royal castle, while the Queen's forces besieged the city from the outside. The civilian population was caught in the middle. The Empress ordered her men to fire incendiary arrows into the town, burning down the magnificent abbey and dozens of homes just to clear a line of sight. The Lady of the English was burning her own capital, September 1141. The Empress's position in Winchester became untenable. She was being starved out by the Queen's superior numbers. She ordered a desperate breakout. This became known as the Rout of Winchester. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The Empress's army was shredded as they tried to flee. In the chaos, the Empress herself had to be disguised and spirited away. But the biggest blow was yet to come. Her right-hand man, her military genius, and her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester, was captured while defending her retreat. The war had reached a bizarre stalemate. The Empress had the king in a dungeon, but the Queen had the Empress's general in hers. Neither side could win without their leader. After weeks of tense negotiation, the Great Exchange was agreed upon. Robert of Gloucester was traded for King Stephen. By November 1141, the pieces were back where they started. Stephen was back on the throne, and Robert was back in Bristol. But the kingdom was unrecognizable. The year of the lady's triumph had ended in a pile of ash and broken promises. On Christmas Day, 1141, Stephen was recrowned at Canterbury Cathedral. He tried to project an image of restored authority, but the mask was slipping. He no longer controlled the north, the west, or the borders. He was the king of a fragment. To keep his remaining barons loyal, he had to give away even more royal lands and titles. The central authority of the English crown, which Henry I had spent a lifetime building, was being liquidated to pay for a war that had no end in sight. December 1142. Stephen had Matilda cornered again, this time in Oxford Castle. He surrounded the fortress, determined to starve her into submission. The siege lasted for months. As Christmas approached, the River Thames froze solid, and the ground was covered in a thick blanket of snow. Matilda was running out of food. Her advisors told her to surrender, but the daughter of the lion had one more trick up her sleeve, one of the most daring escapes in the history of espionage. In the middle of a moonless, freezing night, Matilda and 3 loyal knights dressed themselves entirely in white linen. They lowered themselves down the walls of Oxford Castle, right past Stephen's unsuspecting sentries. They walked 6 miles through the snow, crossing the frozen Thames on foot, and eventually reached the safety of Abingdon. When Stephen's men broke into the castle the next morning, they found it empty. Matilda had become a ghost. This escape became a legend, a story that humanized the cold empress to the common people, even as her political power began to wane. The escape from Oxford marked the end of the big battles phase of the war. What followed was a decade of agonizing stalemate. Neither side had the strength to deliver a knockout blow. The war became a series of small, brutal sieges of minor castles. This was the true anarchy. Agriculture failed. Trade stopped. The currency Henry I had fought to protect was replaced by forged coins issued by local lords. In the next 10 minutes, we will look at the human cost of this decade of darkness, and how a new generation, Matilda's son, Henry Fitz-Empress, began to emerge as the only hope for a dying kingdom. By the mid-1140s, the war had entered its most horrific phase. This wasn't a war of borders, it was a war of attrition. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded that men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. In the areas between the strongholds of Stephen and Matilda, there was no law. Peasants were tortured by adulterine lords to reveal where they had hidden their last scraps of bread. This was a man-made famine. Thousands fled to the woods to live like outlaws, while others simply died in the furrows of the fields they could no longer farm. The lion's peace had been replaced by a silence that smelled of rot. The chroniclers of this era describe horrors that sound like they belong in a dark fantasy novel. Barons would hang men by their feet and smoke them with foul smoke, or put knotted strings around their heads and ride them until they went into the brain. This was the decentralized tyranny Henry I had fought his whole life to prevent. Without a king to punish the powerful punished everyone else. For the American and European audience, this serves as a grim reminder of what happens when the institutions of justice are sacrificed for the sake of a dynastic ego. The church, once the bedrock of Norman society, was helpless. Even the threat of excommunication lost its sting. Warlords like Geoffrey de Mandeville ignored the Pope and the bishops, turning monasteries into fortresses and stables. The social fabric was shredded. People stopped marrying. They stopped baptizing their children. Why bring a life into a world where the only certainty was the arrival of a mercenary troop at your door? The kingdom was literally eating itself. Sensing the weakness at the center, the neighbors moved in. The Welsh princes reclaimed lands they had lost to the conqueror, and King David of Scotland essentially ruled the northern third of England as his own. Stephen was too busy defending his heartland around London to stop them. Matilda was stuck in the west, her influence slowly fading as the barons grew tired of her imperial demands. The Anglo-Norman Empire was no longer a state, it was a collection of warring tribes. But in the south, in the French lands of Anjou, a new power was growing. Henry Fitz-Empress, Matilda's son, was no longer a child. Oh, he was the grandson of the Lion of Justice. and he had inherited his grandfather's relentless energy and his mother's iron will. At just 14 years old, Henry made his first foray into England with a small band of mercenaries. It was a failure, but it was a declaration. He wasn't just fighting for his mother's right, he was fighting for his own. He was the new man for a broken age. The pioneers of the war were dying off. In 1147, the great Robert of Gloucester, the engine of Matilda's cause, passed away. Without her brother, Matilda's military strength in England collapsed. In 1148, she finally left England, returning to Normandy. Many thought this was the end of the war. They thought Stephen had won by default, but they didn't count on the boy. Matilda had realized that she could never be queen, so she poured all her wisdom, her bitterness, and her resources into making sure her son would be king. By 1150, Henry was the Duke of Normandy. He didn't wait for his father or mother to give him power. He took it. He was a whirlwind of activity, moving so fast that his enemies said he seemed to be in two places at once. He began restoring the laws of his grandfather, Henry I, in Normandy. He tore down the illegal castles and rebuilt the courts. He was showing the English barons a preview of what he could do for them. He was offering them the one thing they wanted more than power: stability. In 1152, Henry pulled off a move that shocked all of Europe. Like Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most powerful and beautiful woman in the world, had just had her marriage to the King of France annulled. Within weeks, she married Henry. Overnight, Henry became the master of more land in France than the French king himself. He now controlled Normandy, Anjou, and the vast wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine. He was no longer just a pretender to the English throne. He was the most powerful man in the Western world. January 1153. Henry landed in England for the final time. This wasn't the small raid of a teenager. It was the arrival of a titan. Stephen, now old and grieving the death of his own heir, Eustace, met Henry's army at Wallingford. The two sides prepared for a massive, bloody battle that would decide the fate of England once and for all. As the soldiers sharpened their swords, something strange happened. The barons on both sides refused to fight. They were exhausted. They told the two leaders, "We will not kill each other for your crowns anymore," under the pressure of his own men and the church. Stephen sat down with the son of his greatest enemy. In the Treaty of Winchester, a historic compromise was reached. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but he would adopt Henry as his son and heir. The war was over. The anarchy was ending not with a bang, but with a signature. October 1154. Within a year of signing the Treaty of Winchester, King Stephen was dead. He had lived long enough to see the end of the war, but not long enough to enjoy the peace. His death was a quiet ending to a loud, chaotic life. For 19 years, England had been a land without a center. Now, as the news spread across the Channel to Normandy, the kingdom held its breath. Would there be another coup? Would the barons rise again? But the transition was surprisingly silent. The people were too tired to fight, and the successor was too powerful to challenge. Henry too didn't wait for the weather to clear. In December 1154, he crossed a freezing, stormy sea to claim his crown. He arrived in England not as a celebratory heir, but as a foreman arriving at a ruined construction site. He was 21 years old, possessed of a demonic energy that terrified his contemporaries. He was short-tempered, freckled, and famously restless. He never sat down if he could stand, and he never stood still if he could walk. He was the lion's grandson, and he had come to collect his grandfather's debt. The coronation of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine was the dawn of the Angevin Empire. Together, they ruled a territory that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. But Henry's first priority wasn't expansion. It was restoration. He immediately issued a proclamation declaring that the laws of my grandfather Henry I were back in force. For the people, this was the most beautiful sentence they had heard in 2 decades. It meant that the era of the wolf was over, and the era of the lion had returned. Henry's first order of business was the destruction of the adulterine castles. He gave the barons a simple choice: tear down your illegal fortresses, or I will tear them down for you with you inside. Most of the warlords, seeing the size of Henry's continental army, surrendered. Those who didn't were crushed with a speed and ferocity that reminded everyone of Henry I at the Battle of Tinchebray. In his first year, over 1,000 illegal castles were leveled to the ground. The teeth of the anarchy were being pulled. Next, Henry expelled the foreign mercenaries who had plagued the English countryside for 20 years. Go back to the mud of Flanders was the message. By removing these paid killers, Henry restored the king's monopoly on violence. He re-established the principle that only the king had the right to wage war. For the farmers and merchants of England, the disappearance of these raiding parties meant that for the first time in a generation, they could sleep with their doors unlocked. Henry II went back to the archives. He found the old clerks who had served under his grandfather, the men of the dust who were still alive, and put them back to work. He rebuilt the exchequer from memory and old notes. He needed money to run his empire, and he knew that the only way to get it was through the cold, hard efficiency of the audit. The pipe rolls, the annual records of the royal audit began to be written again. This continuity of record keeping is why we know more about the finances of 12th century England than almost any other medieval state. This is the moment where the English and American legal systems truly begin to take their modern shape. Henry II expanded his grandfather's itinerant justices into a permanent system. He introduced the jury of presentment. He ordered that in every hundred and every village, 12 men should be sworn to tell the truth about who the local criminals were. This shifted the burden of proof from trial by ordeal, like holding a hot iron to the testimony of the community. Henry, I had planted the seeds of the law. Henry too was growing the forest. One of the biggest problems after the anarchy was land ownership. Everyone had stolen land from everyone else. Henry introduced the possessory assises quick, standardized legal actions that allowed a person to reclaim land they had been evicted from during the war. You didn't need a lawyer or a private army. You just needed to prove you had been in possession of the land when the war started. This made the King's Court the most popular place in England. It was fast, it was fair, and it was the final nail in the coffin of feudal warlordism. Historians often look at Henry II as a great innovator, but he was really a great restorer. He spent the first decade of his reign simply trying to reach the level of order his grandfather had achieved by 1130. Henry I. The Beauclerk had designed a blueprint for a state that was so robust it could survive 20 years of civil war and still be functional enough to be rebuilt. This is the true measure of Henry I's genius. He didn't just rule a kingdom, invented the machinery of government. As Henry II looked out over his unified empire, he must have felt the weight of history. If the white ship hadn't sunk, Henry II would never have been king. The tragedy that broke Henry I's heart was the very thing that birthed the Plantagenet dynasty. In the next 20 minutes, we will look at how this new dynasty took the lioness laws and exported them to the world, creating a legacy that defines the concept of justice in America and Europe today. By 1160, the lion's grandson ruled an empire that was the envy of the world. But this wasn't a centralized state like modern France or Germany. It was a collection of different cultures held together by a single legal philosophy. This philosophy that the king's law is supreme, that it must be documented, started with Henry I. This is the common law. It's common because it applied to everyone, from the peaks of the Pyrenees to the docks of London. It was the first time a single legal standard began to unify a diverse population. For the audience in America and Europe, the importance of this cannot be overstated. When you hear the words due process or the rule of law, you are hearing the echoes of Henry I, his obsession with records, and his creation of the Charter of Liberties set a precedent. The king cannot just do whatever he wants. He must follow the law. This idea would travel from Henry I to the Magna Carta, then to the English Bill of Rights, and eventually into the American Constitution. The Lion of Justice wasn't just a king of the 12th century. He was a founding father of Western democracy. Henry I's legacy is written in stone and parchment. He turned England from a conquered province into a legal powerhouse, proved that a king's greatest weapon isn't his sword, but his mind. As we move toward the final chapter of our documentary, we will look at the man behind the myth, the father, the scholar, and the survivor who refused to let his kingdom die with his son. While most kings of his era were content to master the hunt and the tilt yard, Henry I was a man of the mind. His nickname Beauclerk wasn't just a courtesy. It was a testament to a lifelong obsession with knowledge. He spoke multiple languages and was reportedly fascinated by the natural sciences. Henry wasn't just building a kingdom of stone. He was building a kingdom of the intellect. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court, turning the English throne into a beacon for the early 12th century. Renaissance. He understood that power without knowledge is merely brute force. He wanted his reign to be remembered for its wisdom. His curiosity extended to the physical world in a spectacular way. At his palace in Woodstock, Henry I created the first royal menagerie in English history. He collected exotic animals from across the known world: lions, leopards, camels, and even a porcupine sent as a gift from the King of France. To the medieval peasant, these were monsters from legend. To Henry, they were symbols of his global reach. For an American and European audience, this is the origin of the London Zoo. It was a display of dominance, showing that the King of England had the power to tame the wild and bring the far corners of the earth to his doorstep. Henry was also a builder of staggering ambition. He didn't just build defensive towers. He built cathedrals and abbeys that were designed to last for eternity. His crowning achievement was Reading Abbey, a massive complex designed to be his final resting place. The Norman Romanesque style reached its peak under his patronage: thick walls, rounded arches, and a sense of immovable, eternal strength. This architecture was the visual language of his reign. It said that the Normans were here to stay, and that their law was as solid as the stone they carved. We cannot discuss Henry's personal life without addressing his bastard legacy. While he was a faithful political partner to his wives, his private life was a whirlwind of affairs that produced at least 22 acknowledged children. But Henry was a different kind of father. He didn't hide these children in the shadows, integrated them into the machinery of the state. His sons became his most trusted generals, and his daughters became the glue of his international alliances. He created a parallel dynasty that served the crown with a loyalty that legitimate sons often hungry for the throne rarely provided. He turned his personal scandals into a structural strength for the empire. We now reach the core of why Henry I matters to the 21st century. When you look at the legal systems of the United States, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, you are looking at Henry's DNA. He established the permanent curia, the idea that a court should exist as an institution regardless of where the king is located. He moved justice out of the forest and into the courtroom. For the European and American audience, this is the birth of the judiciary, a branch of government that operates on logic and evidence rather than the whim of a local warlord. Henry I was the father of the paper trail. Before him, Land was often granted by the symbolic handing over of a clump of dirt or a branch. He insisted on written orders with a royal seal. He realized that the written word is more permanent than human memory. This documentary revolution is the foundation of modern property rights. Your ability to own a home today, backed by a deed and a title, can be traced back to the clerks of Henry's court, who began recording land transfers in the 1100s. He replaced the word of the Lord with the record of the state. While his grandson Henry II is often called the father of common law, Henry I was the architect who cleared the ground. He created the atmosphere where law could flourish. He proved that a kingdom governed by rules was more profitable and more stable than a kingdom governed by the sword. This is the lion's greatest gift to Western civilization. He taught us that the greatest power a ruler can possess is the power to be fair. We must not romanticize Henry. First, he was a man of blood. To build his world, he had to be a predator. He imprisoned his own brother for nearly 30 years. He executed his enemies without hesitation, maimed his own subjects to protect his currency. The Lion of Justice was a title earned through terror as much as through wisdom. He was a man of his time, brutal, calculating, and often cold. But he used that brutality to end a greater chaos. He was the necessary tyrant who paved the way for a more peaceful future. Henry I died believing he had failed. He died with his son dead, his daughter in a bitter war with her husband, and his nephew prepared to steal his crown. He did not live to see the anarchy end. He did not live to see his grandson, Henry II, build the greatest empire since Rome. But the foundations he laid were so deep that even 19 years of civil war could unwash them away. The lion was gone, but the law remained. Henry I was the youngest son of a conqueror, a landless prince who stole a crown and kept it through sheer brilliance. He was a scholar who understood the power of the ledger. He was a father who lost everything in a single night on a white ship. He was the architect of the Western legal tradition. He was the man who turned the chaos of the Norman Conquest into the stability of the English state. He was Henry, the Lion of Justice. History is a long chain of events, and Henry I is one of its strongest links. As you walk through the cities of Europe or the courts of America, remember the scholar king. His laws are still your laws. His peace is still your peace.